Have you ever wondered what your dreams mean? Join us in Dream School at thisjungianlife.com and find out. Jung wrote, "Dreams are a little hidden door in the innermost and most secret recesses of the soul."
Dream School is a unique, self-paced online program you can start at any time that unlocks access to your inner world. Our 12-month program provides the support, knowledge, and guidance you need to reach within, decipher your personal dream code, and harness it to optimize your life. By enrolling, you'll join an affirming community of fellow travelers, each pursuing a unique quest.
And it's fun. Join us on an adventure to wholeness and healing through understanding your dreams. Go to thisjungianlife.com and click on Dream School. You'll be taken to our secure checkout. Once you join, you'll get immediate access to our first 3 modules. You can get started right away. We look forward to seeing you there.
Welcome to This Jungian Life. 3 good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marchiano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marchiano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
This week, we decided that we wanted to talk about fantasy, which is a topic that I've been hoping we would be able to talk about for a while. One of the things that's going to be a little bit difficult about circumambulating this topic is there's so many different kinds of fantasy. There's so many different potential meanings, even to the word. So we're going to try to be careful with our terms. We'll move back and forth between different senses of the word, between different definitions, and between different ways that fantasy can be used in the psyche. We want to explore it as fully as possible.
So just to kind of begin the conversation, all of the early psychologists were interested in fantasies. You know, the school of French psychologists, Janet and all of them, very interested in fantasies. They had an intuition that there was something important in what's kind of rummaging around in the secret parts of our minds. Freud, of course, was very, very interested in that. He wanted to hear people's free associations. Just tell me what comes up. Don't limit yourself. And Jung was very interested in that as well, and adding to that, dreams, which he thought of as a realm of fantasy material. So we're all in this realm of the subjective part of the psyche, and particularly when it takes an imagistic presentation. What are the ways to relate to that? And when is it helpful? When might it actually be problematic? And everything in between. We've set ourselves a really broad landscape.
But Joseph, I think you may have just landed on something important, which is a fantasy is always an image, isn't it? Can we sort of agree on that? That it's an image produced by the unconscious?
Yes, I think at least the way Jung was talking about it, that he was interested in visible images, visible to the inner eye.
Mm-hmm.
I want to say an image is also an idea, so that it doesn't have to be like the image of a vessel or the image of, something that's specific. It's an idea.
It's an idea, yeah.
And the other is that as we were talking about it beforehand, and we started to talk about it now, is how alive and how big the unconscious is. Because this realm of fantasy is familiar to everyone, and it is not produced by the ego. There can be a dialogue and interaction between fantasy and ego making, quote, sense of it, unquote. But it's really a gigantic area here, and I think it tells us how big we are, how much more of us there is. And how do we want to access it? How do we want to utilize it? Is it life-giving or is it just escapist?
When we were kicking this around, we definitely found that there were some really positive connotations of fantasy and positive ways that it shows up in our lives and in our clients' lives. And then there are some not so positive ones as well. So let's sort of start with the positive.
So my fantasy is that we're going to organize this topic.
Right. That's a fantasy. But if we are going to try to be a little organized, Deb, you were talking about, it can be life-giving. And there's no question that fantasy can be a creative process. That oftentimes we first see a new project or desire or life course in fantasy. We might be hating our job and we find ourselves fantasizing about being a pastry chef. And we keep on picturing ourselves doing that. I'm thinking of The Secret Life of Walter Mitty.
Oh.
And of course, that's all about fantasy, that short story. We might be really unhappy living in the city that we're living in and find that we are cultivating a fantasy about a little home out in the countryside. And these may just stay as fantasies, but it's possible that that fantasy image becomes the germ of a plan that later leads to fulfillment. I mean, I had a fantasy at one point of having a podcast with Deb and Joseph.
Oh, wow. That was really far out.
No, not every fantasy could or should become made manifest, but that fantasies are often where the germ of new life can be found.
I think about how important that is, and I think of it as a funnel. That fantasy of having a stone cottage in some wilderness, remote country area can get funneled down into something more specific. You could start looking at real estate in northern Maine, for example, and then you can make a plan to actually, go look at those kinds of lots up there and try it on. And it might be that the fantasy actually becomes lived in a way that, is this really about living in a more contained, private space? And this condominium on the city skirts is actually going to give me the privacy and containment that I was originally seeking in the fantasy of a cottage. It's a useful kind of funnel to keep processing to see exactly how this wants to be, or if it wants to be, lived out in the world.
So I think what I'm hearing is we've moved from identifying an image or an idea that has a libidinal potential in it.
Mm-hmm.
And then both of you are describing how you vet the image as to whether or not it's going to stay in an imaginal world, a purely imaginal world, or whether it's kind of fit for incarnation. And nature goes through the same process. Not every fetus is viable. And there's an intelligence in a woman's body that decides whether or not something can survive or whether it should be returned to its native elements. And so, interestingly enough, some of the research around the psychology of change uses very similar language, that we might have a fantasy about a podcast, and there's a pre-contemplation stage where there's really no intention to act on it, and it's right fluttering between this level of being somewhat under awareness, but kind of hovering around. Then a little more energy comes around the idea of the podcast, and then it can be actually consciously contemplated, that the person is aware of the fantasy, they're seriously thinking about it, and they may also feel ambivalent about it. God, a podcast would be great, but I'm not sure how to do it, and it's going to gobble up a bunch of time. And then again, in the proving of the image, we might go into a preparation stage where we actually find out about what the heck's involved in literally having a podcast, what are we going to do? Who would we need to contact? And interestingly enough, once we get to this idea of preparing to birth the fantasy, it seems about 50% of people who move, flutter in that direction, retreat, and 50% of the people go forward. And then after that, the test is this actionable? Am I going to take an action on this fantasy? And if we take an action on it, are we going to maintain it? So interestingly enough, the three of us are in the maintenance stage of the fantasy.
That's great, Joseph. And I want to say that I think that fantasies are valuable, or can be valuable, let's say, even when they're not actionable. Just having the fantasy oftentimes can have a real healing effect on the psyche, or a vivifying effect on the psyche. Jung relates at one point the idea of fantasy with inspiration and inner aliveness, and implies that we need to have fantasy in order not to feel a kind of inner deadness. And that certainly maps with my own experience. And a lot of times working with someone who maybe comes in and says, I'm just unhappy. I don't really know what I want. I don't really know what's wrong. I just feel kind of dead. I'll really look for those fantasies. Well, what is it that you imagine for yourself? What do you picture for yourself in 5 years? I'll try to invite the person to really engage in fantasy, not because we're going to necessarily championing this person running out and doing any of these things, but because of the generation of these fantasies in itself is an expression of the psyche's ongoing push toward individuation and wholeness.
So I wonder if what we're talking about here is the creative function of whether it's, that starts with a sort of a life dream of, I'd like to move to Vermont, or that impasse in life of, I don't know what's wrong. And I think Jung has a quote here that I think is relevant, where he says, fantasy is the creative function. The living form is a result of fantasy. Fantasy is a pre-stage of the symbol, but it is an essential characteristic of the symbol that is not mere fantasy. We count upon fantasy to take us out of the impasse. And then he says, dreams are always at work, trying to tell us on one hand of the conflict, and on the other of the creative fantasy that will lead the way out. So I think it ties in with what you were saying, Joseph, about going from the pre-contemplative stage to more energy and so on, or my image of explore that fantasy of a cottage in a remote area, that we do have to turn to these deeper levels that are generative to provide ideas, images, and then we see where it goes in terms of our waking lives, where there's energy.
Yes, and I think these images that come out of that fantasy or fantastical part of the psyche can have a life in any number of different worlds. Mm. So it may be that, I am going to buy that cottage in Scotland, and then maybe it is that in a fantastical world, I'm going to marry a bear, and we're going to live together in a cave in this kind of shamanic alternative world. And that when I imagine marrying my bear wife, I'm full of joy and confidence and participate in this enchantivism of the world. Mm-hmm. And that's maybe where it lives. And feeling enchanted by the world is a concrete benefit of being married to bears.
Yes. Yes, I like that very much. That fantasy enchants the world.
Yes, exactly.
It can.
And that, look at us laughing of what you just came up with. It lets us play.
Mm-hmm. Are you sure I just came up with that?
Is there something
maybe it's confessional?
Yes, it's playful. Fantasy can be playful. I mean, anything can happen in fantasy,
Yes.
right?
And we would all like to hear much more about your bear wife, Joseph, maybe on successive podcasts.
But actually, I'm going to pick up on the bear wife for a second and move into a special category of fantasy that we would be remiss if we did not pick it up, which is sexual fantasies, which are very important, obviously. I mean, it's oft quoted that people's most important sexual organ is their brain. And, that this is how we experience often arousal is through fantasy. That's a very important part of a sexual encounter. And I think it kind of belongs here in our discussion because there can be tremendous positive elements to sexual fantasies, both as things that we might want to act out one day, but also as material that may best be held and explored from a symbolic standpoint, like your bear wife, hopefully. And of course, it can also, as we'll talk about later, it can also be regressive or have a potential downside as well. So, what about sexual fantasies?
Well, I would say that I think it is such an absolutely important part of adolescence and the kind of masturbatory stage that we all go through as adolescents, that as we are imagining various potential sexual partners, we notice whether or not our body has a response to that image. And that begins to formulate very powerful ideas that will carry us in terms of what might I want to experiment with to confirm what my body seems to be responding to in this imaginative place. So I think that early adolescent imaginal sexual exploration sets a stage or allows a stage to emerge more correctly.
I mean, sexual fantasies are interesting because they can have all of the magic and enchantment of any other kind of fantasy, and they involve our bodies in a very immediate way. So they're a super immersive kind of fantasy.
And what a linking function they provide between fantasy and physiology. Of a really way of grounding it in our bodies. Our bodies come right back and tell us that this person is really hot or not.
But this idea of analyzing the sexual fantasy, sadly, that has really fallen out of psychotherapy. And I think that is a tragedy, really a tragedy. Back in the day, your analyst would bring forward, would be very curious and inquiring about, what are you thinking about sexually? How are you functioning in that area? And in this kind of sanitized political environment, a lot of therapists are never trained in how to engage those conversations unless somebody comes in and says, I have a specific sexual problem. But sexual fantasies and behavior are an arena that gives us information about life force.
Yes. And of course, it might be that the sexual fantasy is telling you what you want in bed. That is likely an aspect of it.
Or in other places than the bedroom.
Like a bear's den?
Like a bear's cave? Or the kitchen?
But Joseph, I so appreciate your point about this not being something that comes up for exploration, because it's almost like we just assume that it's concretized, that it's just about sex. But one of my favorite jokes about Jung is that, and I probably said it before on the podcast, Joseph is nodding like I know exactly what you're going to say, that Freud said that religion is all about sex, but Jung said that sex is all about religion. But there can be really important things to be gleaned from the content of your sexual fantasies.
Yes,
like, what is that saying about your psyche, about your soul, about your need for connection and transcendence and any other kind of thing? So the content's important there beyond just the concrete implication for your sex life.
what we're saying, I think, whether it's a fantasy, we'll leave the bear out of it for the moment, but the fantasy of the cottage or sexual fantasies is get curious about it. What does this mean to you and in you and for you about where your life force wants to go?
Yeah. Like where's the energy? Sometimes I'll say to clients, like, where's the energy? Follow the energy. For me, energy often appears, manifests in the psyche as fantasy. By the way, do you think we could get that cottage with the bear?
More enticing.
Scottish cottage with bear.
As long as it's unsweet, it'll all work. So I'm glad we're having a good time, but the overarching thing about fantasy that I think is also so medicinal is that we need to have a realm inside of us in which all things are permitted.
Yes.
And the way in which many of our social or even religious philosophies have intruded upon the imaginal world and decided what is even permitted to be imagined is, I think, makes us unwell.
Mm.
So many psychological methods use some way of going into a deeply relaxed state and then being able to narrate the fantasy material, which is probably being played out just below the surface of awareness, and begin to create a dialogue or description, at very least, about this realm in which all things are permitted, which of course is the realm of dreams as well. There are things you'll believe that you would never believe, and things that you would do which you wouldn't do or couldn't do in the waking life. But in the dream world, all things are permitted, which tells us that on some very deep, deep level, in order to remain sane, we have to participate in these worlds that transgress natural law, for that matter, but also transgress the smallness of our programming.
That's lovely. So one of the problems with fantasy is that we're not allowed it somehow because it feels transgressive, and that can kind of shut down life force. Another possible problem with fantasy is that we take them too literally and feel that everything has to be acted out.
Right. And if that line is gray, then we might find ourselves trying to kill off our fantasy material because we don't feel we can restrain the feelings and energy that they can bring up. Right. So the privilege of allowing all things to be imagined is that I have a clear, what Jung would say, an ethical position about what I will and will not act upon.
This brings up this great concept from this Jungian analyst Goodhart about the secure symbolizing field. He was talking about what happens in analysis, and that things can either be repressed or they can be acted out. And if you're in either of those two realms, you're not in this place where the material is being contained so that it can be related to symbolically. And I think we're talking about similar pulls here with fantasy material. If you tell yourself, I'm not allowed to think that, then you're repressing it and you're killing it off. If you're saying, well, I have a fantasy about buying a cottage in Scotland, so let me go buy it, without any kind of process around that, whether or not this is actually something that needs to be lived out, then you're acting it out. We're really looking for this way that it can be contained, and then it can become, just incredibly creative and productive. And maybe it does need to be then lived out too. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive, but that there's some point in the process where it's just being cooked.
Yeah, that's a great image of the idea of cooking, or the image of fire. And one way to approach fire that builds on what you just said, Lisa, is don't ever light a fire. Fire is bad. Or fire that gets out of control and burns some part of the house down, versus how do we contain it and let it really warm us, cook our food, and serve us in life. Finding our way between those two poles is not always so easy, of either totally repressing versus acting out. But that's the name of the game.
And this goes to ego strength. If we are exercising our ability to think and discriminate and regulate, to make choices, to refine our choices, all of the kind of just good basic life skills, then we can safely learn about ourselves, learn about our shadow. Because a lot of the fantasies people at least will initially bring in an analysis feel highly transgressive and not permitted. But there are other fantasies which are beautiful and life-affirming and spectacular and divine.
Well, and even the ones that feel really transgressive, it might be important to have them.
Right.
Even if it's like, I want to murder my boss or my husband or something like that.
There's life force in all of this.
Yeah.
So it seems like, Joseph, you were talking about ego strength. It seems like a really important thing is to be able to know that something's a fantasy.
Yes.
Right?
Be clear about it.
Yeah.
And then not overvalue it, but not devalue it. So there's this really great quote from the last Harry Potter book. What is that? Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows? Harry meets Dumbledore in some kind of liminal space. Dumbledore is dead. And Harry says something like, is this real, or is it happening in my head? And Dumbledore says, of course it is happening inside your head, Harry. But why on earth should that mean that it is not real?
Yeah.
And this is this place where it is, fantasy is absolutely real.
Yep.
And yet it's not reality. And being able to hold it in that place, then I think we're really into the mundus imaginalis.
Yeah. And I'm thinking about Jung and the experiences he had that he recorded in the Black books that we talked about a few weeks ago, and then the Red book, of that those experiences were incredibly vivid and incredibly real. So we don't confine reality to our waking life and our day world necessarily, and yet at the same time, we have to make a distinction between consciousness and the unconscious, and be able to reflect upon, wow, this is what happened in my inner world. Now I am in my waking life, and that's a different realm. But they're both real, but we have to keep them in their place, like keeping the fire in an appropriate place, in the fireplace, on the stove.
Some analysts will talk about keeping the levels separate. We just know what level at which we're discussing. We know what set of natural laws applies to the fairy tale world versus my physical world versus my social world, for that matter. And that we don't get muddy around what those worlds are, so that we can then hold it in the most creative, constructive way.
Yeah, and then it can really become a tremendous source of creativity and energy and libido in the psyche.
We have been talking about the internal world, but I'm aware that there are a lot of external world options and resources out there. You mentioned Harry Potter, Lisa. That took me off here to all kinds of internet games that people get into. And so we don't have to rely on our own psyches. There's so much out there now that will sort of take us along on various kinds of magical mystery tours.
Yeah, so there's options for consuming fantasy, as it were.
Oh, that's great. Consuming fantasy.
Whether it's fantasy literature, of course, that's a time-honored genre.
And you can take consuming in a couple of different ways. I can buy a science fiction novel or go on the internet or I can and consume it that way, or I can be consumed by it and find that it consumes me. And where is the fine line between having fun and a wonderful experience versus being obsessed by one of the online games?
This is an emerging, area for me to be tossing around, but I think it has something to do with the level of ego awareness, of consciousness relative to these fantasy worlds. I think when someone tells me that, they're gaming online for 5 hours a day and that they feel they literally cannot step away from it, and that if they're really not aware, they might game for 8 hours consecutively. And then they're telling me that this is interfering with them being able to develop in other areas of their lives. There's a way in which, the ego autonomy has been violated in some fashion, and people are trapped in something, in a charm, in some fashion that
they've been bewitched. They've
been bewitched. That's quite right. So I think everything in the right dose and in the right situation can be refreshing. I think this is all in some ways in the realm of play.
Absolutely.
Healthy children are constantly imagining things. I had the great good fortune when I was, in my late 20s to live in a duplex. There was a mom next door that was raising, gosh, I can't even remember how many children it was right now, 6 or 7 children.
Oh my gosh.
And they were all like within a year of each other. They were all babies. So they would just be like teeming around, the house. And if the windows were open, I would hear their little voices kind of float into the house. And they were constantly creating things.
Yeah.
They were alone when they were with each other. I'd see some of them sitting alone on the stoop, and I'd hear them making up songs. And it was right. Extraordinary.
And fantasy play is a really important part of childhood. And it's spoken about just in those terms. And it's open-ended play, often with a peer, that is not directed by an adult, that the kids are working out the rules of the universe where they're inhabiting, they're working it out together. They have to do all of this negotiation. This is why it's so important, fantasy play, for social emotional learning, is because they have to do all of this negotiation for the rules of the world that they're inventing together. So this whole thing about world invention is something that we're just naturally kind of born to do. And then some people sort of turn it into a high art, either through video games or novels or that kind of thing. So you guys were talking some about, getting lost in these fantasy creations and how it can be negative. We're tipping into maybe the downside of fantasy. And the truth is that fantasy can absolutely be defensive or escapist. And then they can interfere with our adaptation to reality and impede our functioning. So when we're clinging to a fantasy, perhaps, of how we think things should be, and that makes us reluctant to face the need to let go of a certain idea for ourselves.
This, if we slide down to very painful territory, we've all had adolescents who had paranoid fantasies that, the neighbor across the street was just out to get them. There's no objective reality about it, but every time they see the curtain flutter, they're sure somebody is looking at them with malicious intent. It's a very vivid, frightening fantasy that is spinning around inside of them. It's really interfering with their sense of well-being. It's interfering with reality and compelling them sometimes to behave strangely. Fantasy is so powerful.
Yeah. And they can keep us out of life too.
The unconscious can take over and kind of possess us in some ways. So, I'm thinking this is really all about the relation between ego or consciousness and the unconscious. And I'm kind of imagining these levels of getting into a really great science fiction book or watching some series on Netflix or something, that all the way down to the mythic realm that Jung experienced. Such a really deep level of the collective unconscious and mythic images. And how do we relate to them in our conscious waking life? Do we use them to enliven us and inspire us and energize us? Or do they get to the place you were talking about, Joseph, where it interferes with our basic functioning, or, as you said, Lisa, our adaptation to reality?
The great example that we all learned about in junior high school is reading Don Quixote. And this story of this old fellow who just lives in his novels, and the novels then populate his interpretation of the outer world. And his donkey becomes a stallion, and this troubled woman becomes his anima, and these windmills become giants that have to be defeated. It's an interesting novel because if it's read critically, it's actually a tragedy. But something in our society, we often valorize these positive fantasies, that when we impose heroism onto something, then all of a sudden people, feel it takes a shine to it.
Well, okay, so that makes me think of the movie Life is Beautiful. Do you remember that movie? And it's sort of like, when escapist fantasy is adaptive and when is it maladaptive? And Life is Beautiful was, I don't know, late 1990s, Roberto Benigni, I think. And it was, he and his son wind up in a concentration camp, and he creates all of these fantasies for his son so that his son doesn't realize what's going on. And he weaves a protective fantasy around the child. But again, it's, sometimes it's really adaptive to create a fantasy for yourself so that you don't realize how bad things are. That can really work, and it can really not work too. So again, looking at the negative side of fantasies and how they operate in our lives, sometimes we have a not entirely conscious fantasy of how things should be. And if we're not conscious of it, it kind of operates in the background, and it can really impair us. I'm thinking of maybe someone who is in an unhappy marriage, and rather than making peace with the marriage and working on it maybe, or deciding that it's not going to work and leaving, kind of has fantasy after fantasy with different men, that she's going to fall in love with them, or, he's going to sweep her away. And so never really, because the fantasy is so satisfying of being with one of these other men, there's never any real interrogation about what's going on in her life and what's driving her to stay in a situation in which she's unhappy. The fantasy almost is a palliative that numbs her out enough that she can stay, and then nothing really changes.
So then we're in the realm of dissociation, which can have many different gradations. It can be very subtle. It can be very catatonic, very dramatic. So in that example, we can imagine the woman is delinking or dissociating from the actual relationship or her feelings about the relationship. And Jung warns about this as he's trying to, in himself, categorize fantasies. He talks about the passive fantasy as being relatively dissociative. There's a withdrawal of conscious control. It's visionary, and that it's rooted almost exclusively in unconscious processes that are taking people away from themselves, and really is problematic.
I'm extending this idea to the power of belief and narrative, of cultural beliefs, all kinds of beliefs that are instilled, that we've grabbed onto, of how life should be and what will happen. And that there is that underlying passivity there. Thinking of that song about someday my prince will come. that I don't have to do anything. I can rely upon this belief, this structure, and that it's subliminal enough so that the person doesn't notice that this is what is running his or her life.
Mm-hmm.
Talking about that as an attitude, Deb, how it shows up for me is when clients are, or we discover that they're constantly telling themselves, well, it just doesn't matter. That doesn't matter. That doesn't matter. That doesn't matter. And when that finally becomes clear that that's kind of a mantra, I really try to encourage them and say, well, what if everything mattered on some level? That everything matters. It really changes the intensity of actual engagement versus kind of floating away.
That's really interesting. Yeah. I'm thinking back to, I think what we've been talking about the past couple of minutes relates back to what we spoke about earlier about being able to hold it in the right way. And there's this really wonderful quote by Marie-Louise von Franz from her book on alchemy that I think just gets right at the heart of this. She says, "The great difficulty is to save the fantasy, which is life-giving, and cut away the childishness of the wish to realize it." So the fantasy is life-giving, but the insistence on realizing it, on concretizing it, can be actually deadening or destructive. Sometimes. Sometimes fantasies can and should be realized, but not all the time. And we have to have a discernment process to know the difference.
It's actually central to the idea of alchemical transformation that as we contain these deep drives inside of ourselves and we bear their frustration, that they then begin to give off a kind of symbolic vapor. And that vapor often produces images and fantasies. And then as we tolerate those fantasies, there is a kind of relationship that develops between the drives and the fantasies that creates a circulatio or an Ouroboros situation. And the energy stays inside this psyche and keeps all this wanting and longing, rises up, penetrates the fantasies, it cools off, and then it rises up again. And something curative happens in the soul as we tolerate that circle over and over again. And Jung said if it's done in the most exquisite way, it can lead to the incarnation of the self.
Oh, that's lovely.
And so maybe that's a good place to transition into a dream.
Hi, this is Joseph from This Jungian Life podcast. Lisa, Deb, and I have been deeply moved by your responses to our work. Producing, editing, and distributing it involves substantial expenses, and now we need your help. Please stop by our website, thisjungianlife.com, and click on the heading Be Our Patron. You'll be redirected to our Patreon funding page. Patreon helps creators connect with people who believe in projects like ours. There, you can sign up with your credit card to support us with as little as $1 a month. And at higher levels of support, we'll provide special episodes, behind-the-scenes photos and stories, and a chance to join a select pool of listeners for dream interpretations. Thank you.
Our dreamer this week is a 45-year-old woman who is an editor and a writer, and here's the dream. I'm in a small underground room. Near the ceiling, in a shadowy corner, hangs a cocoon or nest. It looks like a felted mitten and contains sleeping baby bats. Frightened, I summon my husband and quietly point out the nest. He agrees that we should take care not to wake the baby bats, for even though they are tiny and blind, they are not vulnerable. I whisper the phrase, "Dangerous little experts." We stand as still as we can in the dark. The next scene is outdoors and sunny. I'm in the middle of a street that is normally busy but now empty. A snowy owl appears before me on the pavement. I again summon my husband, and as we admire the owl, 5 more snowies arrive. They grow until they stand about 4 feet tall, then begin hopping and spinning and flapping, almost like they're performing a ceremonial Native American dance. I suspect they are children wearing feather costumes, but no, they really are owls. My husband and I are thrilled and honored. The street seems alive with magic. And for context, the dreamer tells us that she had this dream on the eve of her 45th birthday, although she had gone to bed feeling melancholy. She says she's disconnected from family and some friends, but she's very fortunate that her marriage is strong and full of love, and she has satisfying work. The main feelings in the dream were apprehension with regard to the bats, and with regard to the owls, curiosity, awe, and gratitude. She also adds that birds fascinate her, and that recently she saw a great horned owl at dusk pursuing a smaller bird, and that it was a dramatic chase across the sky, with the owl eventually giving up, but the owl then flew right past her, and she found it electrifying. She says she appreciates the bats are cool, but they do, quote, skeeve me out a little, as they do most of us, I think. I just add that as editorial comment. And that she does see bats flying around their home. So what do we think?
Well, I guess I'll start by saying this might be a place where I would pull out a symbol dictionary and want to look up bats and owls and find out more about them. So perhaps we'll do that as we discuss the dream. But the other thing that jumps out at me, of course, is that this is a dream in 2 parts. I always find it interesting to notice how many distinct scenes there are, and then to understand how the scenes are interrelated. And these scenes are opposite of one another. One is underground and in the dark. The other is outdoors and in the sunlight. In one dream, there's a whole bunch of little baby bats, which are almost always black. And in another scene, there's a bunch of snowy white juvenile owls. So they're sort of inverse of one another. The one is black, the other's white. There's a really kind of yin yang thing going on here.
Yes, there really is. And the bats are small and the snowy owls are large. So there are a lot of polarities here, aren't there? I also notice she says in her context that her marriage is strong and full of love. And in her dream, on both occasions, she summons her husband. So it's a nice image, I think, of her partnership and her husband as a positive and supportive, companioning inner masculine or animus figure.
I mean, the ego is having a hard time mustering the strength to deal with this instinctive level in the psyche. And it's a good sign, as you said, that she's got access to the animus. Mm-hmm. I'm also thinking about the comparison between bats and owls. And it is abnormal to see owls dancing around in the bright sunlight.
4 feet tall.
Well, 4 feet tall notwithstanding. You know, bats and owls are both denizens of the night. Mm-hmm. And they have all of this specialized apparatus to navigate deftly. Bats are mammals, owls are birds. I mean, they're these different order of beings.
But they're both predators.
Right. Both nighttime predators. The owls dancing around in the sunlight in a Native American ceremony. That's very compelling to me. It's interesting. I have had a handful of other clients in the last few months that have dreamt of supernatural owls. So it's really captures my attention that, you know, this is showing up yet again, and owl energy.
Well, and they're almost anthropomorphic owls because they're, you know, they're almost like kids in owl costumes, you know, so they're not just owls.
Well, there's clearly something godlike about them.
Yeah.
If we think about them in terms of Native American spirituality, to don the costume of the spirit animal and to dance is to invoke them, to embody them, and to curry favor. In one shamanic tradition, the dancing of the animal is thought to be a kind of exchange, that the shaman allows the spirit animal to use their body to be able to amble through the physical world in this ritualized way. And then in exchange, the spirit animal assists the shaman in these various spiritual tasks, navigating the inner world. So there's this blending of the worlds that happens in the ritual of the dance. And that the owls are tolerable, and the bats, in a sense, represent the same nighttime flying creature that the ego finds. In a sense, the shadow of the owl is the bat.
Right. And one of my thoughts about it is that they agree not to disturb the nest of the bats. There's a kind of appropriate reverence toward the bats. They're going to let them be in that place. They're not going to try to destroy them. They're not wanton about how they approach them. She and her husband try to stay as still as possible. And I wonder if that's an image of the ego being in sort of right relationship with some kind of unconscious content, that there's a healthy respect there, but also an ability to tolerate it. They can just stand there and be as still as possible. And that enables that content to kind of come closer to consciousness and appear in the form of these sort of theriomorphic owls.
I'm curious here about the relationship to sort of the human world, that their nest looks like a felted mitten, which also seems to indicate that although part of the dream ego feels that it's sort of awful and foreign and is frightened, there's an association with something very human and warming here, the mitten. So it's not totally separated from the world of culture and humanity. And then I am really smitten with the phrase dangerous little experts.
Yes.
Yeah.
Of all the things that one might say about baby bats, that is an interesting phrase, that they are dangerous and they're expert. And I like what you were saying about the right relation to shadow, of the respect there.
It's also in how she talks about them, that they are, even though, what does she say? Even though they're
Tiny
young,
and blind.
even though they're tiny and blind, they are not vulnerable.
Yeah.
Is that the right wording?
Yeah.
There's some power acknowledged here that these little beings have, that they're, there's respect for them.
But, very often, when I think about bats and, Halloween costumes and vampire legends and all kinds of other things, bats are usually a symbol of something that the ego shrinks from, demonizes, scared of. And although she says she's frightened, the dream ego does not do that. It does not attribute to these little creatures that level of demonization. And so more and more, I like what you lifted up, Lisa, about there's something here about the relationship to shadow, of the respect, a certain level of trepidation, but not just consigning it to the realm of total darkness and evil.
No, I think that seeing the bats as evil doesn't kind of do it justice. I think bats, if we take a more naturalistic approach, are gentle, they're shy, they're fastidious. They actually are very tidy housekeepers. In Asia, the bat is associated with the maternal aspect of the great goddess, and the attunement that a mother bat has for her baby that even in a cave with maybe tens of thousands of creatures squeaking, a mother bat can instantly know the sound of her baby. So I think that it can represent a lot of things, but the fact that they're tucked away so cozily in this wool sock, to me, represents something about the mother archetype. They're underground, they're in a cave, the warm womb-like sock, the maternal tending of the mammalian bat. I'm wondering if this represents a kind of ambivalence about the mother, perhaps even her being a mother, and thinking of the possibility of children as kind of vampiric things that are dangerous little experts, which
They
can
are.
be, they are, babies are dangerous little experts, that is gestating in the unconscious. Perhaps, as she says, that, she's rather alone. She's 45 years old. It's just she and her husband, very loving. But this question about what are the babies in the psyche doing deep, deep underground?
Yeah.
And, she's very ambivalent about encountering them and perhaps what they would require from her.
Yeah.
So not a lot of people have babies or get pregnant at 45. But she's got a sock of squirmy life in her underworld that she's ambivalent about.
And, bats are associated to a certain extent with death and darkness, and owls are as well. Owls, in some cultures, an owl alighting on a dwelling is a presentiment of death. And they are associated with the goddess and also fertility and regeneration. So there is a sense here of some kind of new life. I agree with you, Joseph, both that this is a nest and then also that these owls kind of burst forth.
And I like that she feels that the owls are kind of like children. She confirms in the dream, but they really are owls. That the children inside of her, when they show up in the chthonic world, are scary, dangerous little experts. But when they show up in the sunny, bright world of her waking mind, her ego consciousness, they're charming, magical, dancing children on the pavement. But to me, I think they are the same energy, and it shows this polarity of her relationship to it. And just as you both said, the animus is companioning her to get a glimpse and forge some kind of rapport with both the shadow and light side of whatever these inner children represent to her.
Yeah, it's both sides of that polarity, as we've already pointed out. The dark underground room, the sunny day, the black bats, the white owls, the small bats, the large owls. It's a nice kind of image of wholeness of both sides having equal time, as it were.
Yeah, and something coming forward into greater connection with ego consciousness too.
Yeah.
Sometimes we see that in a dream series where there's a particular content that we can watch as it changes and shifts over each subsequent dream and becomes more realized and more integrated and more related to the ego. And this really happens in the dream because the baby bats are not particularly well related to the ego. In fact, the ego is kind of skeeved out. But because I think she can tolerate them, in the next scene, she is better related to them. They're still pretty other, but something's moving toward conscious integration. By the way, we would also think about this as an archetypal dream because there are these magical dancing owls. And it's quite numinous, just like her encounter with the great horned owl was in waking life.
I have a fantasy about her occupation as an editor and a writer. There is an aspect or a way of writing that is akin to hunting in the night. So we can write from an ego stance, using our intellect, our skill sets, our ability to think through material. But what may be waking in her is this access and ability to go into the unconscious and hunt. And bats and owls hunt for different things, but they have this extraordinary heightened sense and safety, this ability to negotiate in the dark. Right now, she's ambivalent about the bats, although she's charmed by the owls. I would suspect that as these capacities emerge in her, she's on the verge of developing this access to the unconscious and perhaps an ability to translate that into her work.
Oh, I like that, Joseph. I
Yeah.
think that sounds just right.
I like it too. This is a dream that she says she had on the eve of her 45th birthday. I think it's a really encouraging dream about new life, what lies ahead, possibility.
I also think that because both of them are predators, there's lots of night dwellers, but these are predators, that there's something about hunting in the night as a writer that requires a kind of abandonment of ambivalence.
Mm-hmm.
To be able to zoom into one's dark places and grab hold of something and be determined that you are going to eat it, that you're going to dissect it and swallow it down in a way that the waking mind might find grotesque or shocking or too primal. But in order for her to really bring it back to the waking life, she can't just, hold it at the edges of her fingers and just kind of dance it, and drop it with distaste. She's going to have to eat it.
Yeah. She's going to have to really grab it with her talons.
And dig right in and slurp it down and integrate it and metabolize it.
Mm-hmm.
So the things that are scurrying around in her, which are the prey of great owls, that's going to require a kind of objectivity, and an abandonment of sentimentality, which I think are formidable qualities in a writer.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, we have to dive into shadow to really get hold of the treasures within, and some of the more seemingly aversive to ego kind of contents in there too. Sort of like gobbling down a mouse.
Treasures and meaty tidbits.
There it is.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.